Well, there was a little boy in Sunday school who was quizzed by his teacher on the things of Easter. "What is Good Friday?" the teacher asked. The boy responded, "Oh, Good Friday is the day where we remember when Jesus died." "Very good," the teacher said. And how did Jesus die?" The boy thought for a moment and said, "Well, he died by being placed on a cross between two thieves." The teacher was happy with the child's knowledge of Easter. So she asked one more question, "And what happened 3 days later?" Without a thought, the boy answered, "After 3 days, the stone was rolled away from the tomb, and Jesus rose from the dead. And if he sees his shadow, there'll be 6 more weeks of winter." Obviously, Jesus saw his shadow. But the presence of the snow outside does not dampen the glory of this morning. Jesus is risen, the stone was rolled away, the tomb is empty. The gospel reading is John's telling of that first glorious morning, of how the disciples and Mary, they come to the tomb and they look in and they see the emptiness. But there is a difference. There's a difference between simply noticing the facts and the bold acknowledgement of the power of God. Easter is different. There is difference in looking to Jesus as the one who is past and no longer, and seeing the glory of Jesus as the risen Savior. Easter is different. Obviously, this morning we are pointed to the reality of the resurrection, the power of God in life, and the presence of Jesus here for us all. Now, for us who may have been around the block in church circles for a little while, the news of resurrection is not that shocking anymore. We've heard the story. We've been here before. We know the basic premise. But we need to remember that resurrection was never on the books for the disciples. Even as much as Jesus talked about it and said that he would be killed, in 3 days he would rise again, they did not have one inkling, one iota of thought that would suggest that Jesus would rise from the grave. It wasn't even on their minds. It wasn't on their radar. Because let's be honest, that message sounds kind of foolish, doesn't it? So once Jesus died, in their minds, that was it. Jesus was gone. There was no more. The movement that they had been a part of for 3 years, it was done. And the disciples, as anybody would at this point, they disbanded. They kind of went their own way. Mary, and probably some of the other women, they go to the tomb of Jesus that first morning. But they don't go looking for the resurrected Lord. They come because Jesus is dead. They have come early in the morning while it is still dark to anoint him and to grieve. When Peter and John run to the tomb, after Mary comes back and says, "The stone's rolled away, he's gone, I don't know where he is," they run to the tomb because they urgently wish to view the empty tomb. And they hope to discern what happened to Jesus' body. Easter morning, a morning of resurrection, didn't make any sense. I wonder if any of us are confused by Easter. How can we possibly believe that someone like Jesus rose from the dead? How can we possibly believe that God would actually wrap God's self in flesh, live amongst us, be brutally executed, and then rise? And how is that supposed to bring us forgiveness and healing and everlasting life? It just doesn't make any sense. And you're right, it doesn't. It doesn't make any sense. not from any human point of view. There's this fabulous scene in our gospel where Peter and John reach the tomb. John is never mentioned. He is just mentioned as the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and a lot of scholars say that that would have been the Apostle John. So they run to the tomb. In verse 6 it says, "Then Peter, who was behind John, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth. And then finally, the other disciple who reached the tomb first, John, also went inside. And it says, he saw and believed." The interesting thing about that kind of snippet, that scene, is that in the Greek original text, there is a little bit of a play on words. There is two different words, what we might translate as saw. Peter, he goes into the tomb and he observes. He sees with his eyes. He notices the absence of the body, the position of the cloth, and he's trying to figure it out. He's just noticing everything. John, he enters into the tomb, and the English text says he saw and believed. It's more like he beheld. He beheld what was happening. He looks at the absence of the body, and internally he believes that God has acted. That Jesus has not been taken by grave robbers. He's not been taken by authorities. That the disciples didn't just happen to go to the mistaken tomb. That this, in some way, the empty tomb, in some way, testifies to the mighty action of God on behalf of God's people. It'd be an interesting question. If you had to pick, who would you say you are? Are you Peter or are you John? Are you Peter? Have you come to the empty tomb, but have you only come looking for a human body? A human teacher? Someone who taught and lived long ago in the pages of history but is no more. Someone for whom you might say, I respect, I adore, you may even say, I worship. But the fact is that he is no longer around. Have you come thinking to yourself, well, there has to be some logical explanation for the empty tomb. And as soon as we figure it out, we will find the body. Or are you John? Do you look into the empty tomb? Do you see the emptiness? Do you see the linen cloth? And do you find that deep within you there is a voice that says, God must have done something? Of course, it doesn't mean that you have everything figured out, that you understand everything. John didn't. It says that John looked in and saw and believed, but at the very next verse, it says that they still didn't understand that Jesus had to rise from the grave. But still there was a sense, beyond any rationale, beyond any human explanation, that in some way, the empty tomb testifies to God's power and God's love. That the empty tomb somehow reflects that the power of darkness, that the forces of hatred, sin, and violence and death are overcome by the power of God's grace and God's love. Now, I ask you who you are, Peter or John, and in some sense, that's an unfair question. Because the point of Easter is not to simply believe that the empty tomb reflects God's power. The point of Easter is not to simply believe a certain thing about the tomb. The point of Easter is to meet the risen Savior. Jesus rose, not as some theological abstraction, devoid of any connection to our life. He is not the resurrection is not something fit only for creeds and scriptures. Jesus rose in order to call us into a life defined by his presence here for us. It is in him, connecting with him as alive today, that we live amid the forgiveness and the healing that we say that we believe in. See, the fact of the matter if the resurrection doesn't have any connection to our life, if Jesus is not here and now, then everything that we believe begins to start to crumble. Because it means that Jesus was wrong. He was wrong about who he said he was. He was wrong about what he said would happen. And all of a sudden, forgiveness, all of a sudden grace, all of a sudden mercy, all of a sudden entrance into the divine love of God